Afternoon. Let's go ahead and get started. My name is David Fitzgerald, and I am the co-director of the Center for Comparative Immigration Studies at the University of California, San Diego. Today, as in all of our events, we are co-hosting together with our friends at the UCLA Center for the Study of International Migration. You can find information about all of our upcoming events on the websites of both centers. Our next Zoom book panel will be in January 21st. We'll be discussing Brexitland, Identity, Diversity, and the Reshaping of British Politics by Maria Sobolewska and Robert Ford. But today's panel is about a transatlantic look at the politics of classification of terms like refugee and migrant, forced migrant. We're joined from Tel Aviv by Karen Akoka. She is Associate Professor of Political Science at Paris-Nanterre University. She'll be talking about her book, L'Asile et l'Exil, une histoire de la distinction réfugiés migrants. Special thanks to her for spending her Friday night with us. Our second author is Rebecca Hamlin, Associate Professor of Legal Studies and Political Science at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Her new book is titled Crossing: How We Label and React to People on the Move. Our discussant is co-host Roger Waldinger, Distinguished Professor of Sociology and Director of the UCLA Center for the Study of International Migration. So the order of activities today, as always, is each author will give about a 25-minute overview of the book. We'll kick it over to Roger for a 10-minute comment, and then back to each author for a brief response. Then we'll have a live open discussion with all of the folks who are here on the call today. At that time, feel free to electronically raise your hand to be unmuted and to ask your question live, or if you prefer, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and I will read the question out loud. So without further ado, please welcome Karen Akoka. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be with you and to introduce this book, which is a book in French, and I excuse my heavy accent. I hope you still understand me. And so it's also the opportunity for me to make my work be more known with the English speaker. I'll try to share the screen here. It was working before. Okay, it's not anymore. It doesn't matter. Just try once again, and if it doesn't work, yes, it does. Perfect. So, do you all see the screen? Is it okay? Let's say it's okay. Sorry, I did something wrong again. I don't see you anymore, but if you say to me that you see
yes,
me,
we see your screen.
Yeah, and you see the screen. I don't know why I don't see it anymore. I'm sorry. Just a second.
Meanwhile, here is the first book.
Sorry.
And we have the second book. Happy to hold in my hand, still hot off the press, hot to the touch.
I touched something in my computer. I'm sorry, and I don't see anybody anymore. I did wrong. Try here. Okay. It's you here, and excuse me. And last, okay. Here we go. Everything's fixed. Sorry. So, so this book, L'Asile et l'Exil, a history of the distinction between refugee and migrant, is a book that is trying to question the distinction between refugee and migrants, and also to question the hierarchy that puts foreigners labeled refugees as more deserving help and protection that foreigners labeled like migrants. And so the question behind it is, by questioning the distinction between refugee and migrants, it's questioning the dichotomies, the binarity that are building the category, individual versus collective, political versus economic, forced versus voluntary migration. And on this, I won't develop too much, and I think Rebecca Hamlin will give much more insight into this. But this is the first type of question that the books comes with, and the hierarchy is in a way the question behind the hierarchy question is, why is it worse to risk dying in prison than risking dying of hunger? And how did we build this type of hierarchy, which is now so obvious to most of us that we don't even question it anymore? For English readers, I have a chapter of the book that's published in English in this book about the comparison of the resettlement of both people in Europe, and so this is maybe the way you can get into my work in English. So I put here this image because for me it's very important. If she drowned, she's a refugee. If she floats, she's an economic migrant, because it says how much we embodied the idea of there is something like a substance of what is a refugee that would be different, that the essence of what's a migrant. And
sorry to interrupt, but just so you know that we actually cannot see your screen. It says you've started screen sharing.
You don't see the screen. Okay. Let's forget about it. It's okay.
Maybe it would be better for Karen to send you the PowerPoint and do the share from San Diego and segue to Rebecca and then come back to Karen.
Sure.
Wait, I can try. Maybe I can try again just to share the screen and you tell me if it, yeah, but it's okay. Let's forget about it because I'm going to take time to send it to you. It's too bad. I can talk to you about this without sharing. I'll try a last time and okay, it's okay. So and for me the disturbing thing is how much, so this idea of a different essence between refugee and migrants, it's the idea that's it's in the political field, in the public opinion, in the institutional field, but I feel it's an idea that's very strong still in the academic field, and this is maybe what's the most important for me, because I arrived to a point where, you know, when I read a refugee who arrive and for me there's no after working on this distinction, a refugee is someone who able to obtain an administrative status. It's nothing more than an administrative category, and I think that one of the reasons why also in the academic world it's so strong still, this idea of a difference, is that it's because the refugee status gives so much that and there is such an importance of a critical view on today politics on refugee and migration, that it's still taking the idea of real fake in order to criticize also the political situation, which is indeed very potentially criticable. So how do I do this? How do I question this distinction? How do I question the hierarchy? I question it by using history. History for me is not only a way to understand the past, but it's a very important tool of rupture with institutional categories, rupture with the way we embody the common sense world. So by seeing that things were different before, it's a very strong way in order to think that what seems obvious to us is not so obvious. And so what I study is the history of the institution in France who labels, who gave the label refugee migrants. So this institution is called Ofpra. It was created in 1951 at the same time that the Geneva Convention. And I looked at how since 1951 till today, this institution gave or didn't give the refugee label. And what I looked particularly is the day-to-day practices of this institution, and also the profile and the trajectories of agents that are working there. So the idea is to tackle this question of distinction in hierarchy with history, but not with any history, but with social history of people who practice daily practice. So it's kind of history from below of labeling. So what of course I have to go very fast. So I studied like 60 years of labeling in France. So what can some things that I can say, and here I speak much more about the history and not so much about today. So Ofpra was created, I said, in 1951. It replaced ERO, the International Refugee Organization, and at the same time that the Geneva Convention replaced the interwar conventions. And this switch is thought in many genera. This switch is thought as like a very big rupture in France, but it's also the same, more or less the same elsewhere. Suddenly it's a national institution with another definition of the refugee, the one of the Geneva Convention, that takes on the labeling work. And what you see, if you look very carefully at practices and at profiles and trajectories of agents, because one of the very strong ideas my work is I'm sorry for the English, my work lies on is the idea that refugee, the refugee category says much more about those who give the labeling than those who are labeled. And so to understand it, it's important to reverse the way we usually look and look to those who label, because it says much more than about the ones who are labeled. So if you look at this time, who are the people working there and how are they working, then you see something different than what you see if you just look at how laws or big structures are changing. And then you see in Ofpra, you have protection officers, agents of Ofpra, who are themselves refugees, who are not French. And then you understand a little bit more the fact that it's people coming from IRO, from the International Refugee Organization, and in their practices, the way they label is still on collective definition of refugee, as in the interwar period, and not on the search of individual persecution. So they work in the same building even than IRO. So what do you have is mostly you have Hungarian refugees, Russian refugees, Polish, Czechoslovaks, most of them coming from Eastern Europe, speaking their own language in this French institution, writing in their own language, and giving refugee status on the basis of the nationality of their own compatriots. And this continues until it's not like the first 5 years of Ofpra, but this continues until the 1980s. And these agents, they're also not only refugees and foreigners, but they're also former diplomats of their own country, or sometimes very high-ranking position. They held very high-ranking position, political position in their country. There is like a deputy of the Duma, the Russian parliament. There is a Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine. There is a former governor of Georgia. So it's a very strong profiles, and it can't be by chance. And when you look at the whole scene, you understand that there are kind of what I call the parallel diplomacy, like a parallel diplomacy, because there are diplomacy of a regimes that don't exist anymore, but because they were thrown out, or by the invasions of USSR in Georgia, Ukraine, Armenia, or by communist takeover. But there are regimes that in some still exist in this framework that the French government sustains, because it goes very well towards its own interest in the times of the Cold War and the need of this ideological war. So there are parallel diplomacy of regimes that don't exist anymore, but and they go very well with the priorities of the French government at this time of Cold War. And if you look at this situation contrasts very much with the way which we are treated, people coming from countries that have very strong diplomatic ties with France, which are Yugoslavia, Portugal, Greece, Spain. But what's very interesting is that the way people from these countries who ask for asylum are treated is that they're not blatantly rejected. They are oriented towards immigration channels. And so, for example, there is no agent for Portugal or for Greece at Ofpra. And if someone comes from this country, they are told, oh, there's no asylum for Greeks or Portugal, but you can go to the immigration channel, and through the immigration channel they were getting a status, and so this period is interesting because this is possible because the immigration channel was open, and it's also possible because at that time there is no strong difference in terms of rights between refugee and worker status, migrant worker status. And you would get more or less kind of the same rights with one or the other. So it's a very, to my view, it's a very interesting period because at this time being a refugee doesn't go through the paradigm, which is our strong paradigm of real or fake. There is no statistics even, on the number of rejection and recognition. And there is the word asylum seeker doesn't even exist until the beginning of the 80s. It's more or less, it's more the paradigm of desirable as refugee or desirable as migrants. There are nationalities that are desired as refugees, and there are nationalities that are desirable as migrants, and they are pushed towards one or the other channel, migrant or refugee channel. And so being a refugee is somehow at the intersection between political priorities of the government, but also there's more room for the choice of people who can go towards the status that says more the way they feel in exile as a refugee or as a migrant. And so there is what I call you say porosity of usage that reflects the porosity of these categories that are very different. That's what the idea of the dichotomy that we have today, and so this is more or less because I have to go fast the situation until the 80s, and in the 80s you have this moment of change in the French set, but it's more or less the same also in other settings. And in the 80s, you have two paradigmatic type of cases. You have both people coming from ex-Indochina, and you have people coming from Zaire. And it's a moment where you have these two groups that treated in a totally different way. The people from Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, they are automatically recognized as refugees. There is 90% recognition rate, even without interviews. They are called refugees before putting a file. The agents that are taking care of them, they are people from Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos. There is a very high rate. And at the same time, you have people from Zaire who are arriving, and the agents are not from Africa, they're French. They're called asylum seekers. It's the beginning of how they're called, of this name. The rates are very low, and for me, the year of the 80s is the year of the coexistence of these two regimes. What I call the regime of refugees. That was this regime of recognition on nationality, and high rates, and asylum political subordinated to foreign affairs imperatives. And the regime of asylum seekers is this regime that's more or less starting in the 80s, and it's going to become the regime after that until today, of asylum politics subordinated to migration policies and low rates and agents that are completely different from the people seeking asylums, etc., etc. So I go very quickly to the reasons of this, because this is not the most important when you speak about, it's important, but it's not the less interesting when you speak about social history, but it's very macro reason. It's the end of the Cold War, of course. It's the time where immigration is labeled as a problem. It's the time where welfare state is labeled as a problem. So it's the beginning of the idea of austerity, judicial austerity, budgetary austerity. It's also a time, there are also all post-colonial question with these African countries gaining independence, and the importance for France to have very good relationship with their former colonies. So there is a set of reasons that explain this change of policy, and one of the very important tools is the interpretation of the convention with the idea of looking for individual persecution. When in the 50s, 60s, 70s, with people from Eastern Europe, or with people flying communist regime from Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, there is no search of individual persecution. They could say, I come for work, and they would get refugee status. I'm slightly exaggerating, but really not so much. I saw files of people in the archives where you say, I come from work, and there's a refugee status. So it's really based on the nationality of the people, and the regime of the asylum seekers is really based on the interpretation of the Geneva Convention. We're looking at individual persecution, and we can then have this whole discussion about the fact that in the convention, the idea of individual persecution is not mentioned, but the search of individual is for me is an interpretation of the convention, which is a tool for the rejection due to these all these macro events, and that you can see in Ofpra in the way which agents are recruited, what are the new practices, etc., etc. So maybe to finish, for me, I'm a historian, but I'm more of a sociologist and a political science. I work with archives and interviews also, but if I did all this work, it's also to understand today's situation. And I think that what it helps us is to understand that our vision of today is also built up on a false representation of what was asylum yesterday, because there is very strong the idea of this archetype of the real refugee that was the Russian dissident and fleeing individual persecution. And, you know, there is this whole thing that the author Chimini showed very well, the myth of the difference, the idea that today's people coming from the South are different profiles that people coming in the past from Eastern Europe. And I think looking at the archives, you show that there is no there is a difference, of course, of nationality, but people at the time were not more individually most of these people were not individually persecuted, and they were recognized on the basis of their nationality. And so it shows how we have a representation of today and of the changes that's linked to this archetype of refugee that never really existed. The other thing which is interesting for me is that to think at the refugee category and to grasp how much the refugee category is constructed by the way it's used, and there is a very wide place for interpretation of the Geneva Convention, and so how much this approach of looking at those who label as looking at the category refugee to understand those who label is an approach that is heuristic, and then it's interesting also for the question of the continuity and the rupture, because this idea that 1951 was a rupture, looking at the French case and the history, it's highly questionable. And maybe the last thing that it helps also to understand is that how there was in the 80s this I call it décrochage. I don't know if you say décrochage in France, but in a way, the refugee and the migrant category, which were not so different in the way they were used and in the rights they were brought, some are separated very strongly with this new paradigm of real and fake, with the fact that the rights of the refugee were very strong, where the rights of workers, migrant workers went less and less strong, and how also this category are constructed by the content of the law, not only on the definition, but on the rights they are bringing, and paradoxally, I speak of ennoblissement. Ennoblissement is that the refugee I looked also within the 60 years how slowly the refugee status becomes more and more noble. We have this idea that it was always very noble because it's a way of projecting the present into the past, but it's also the history how the refugee status gets very noble, and the more noble it gets, the more harder it can be reached. And so there is this paradox where the agents of this institution today, they protect asylum by protecting it they protect asylum by restricting it. And I think you can understand better this paradox if you look at the long story. So I think that's over for my time. Maybe I spoke a little bit too much. Sorry for my accent and for my English, and thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Karen. That was great. Let's turn it over to Rebecca Hanlon.
Unfortunately, the filling is oozing out.
What?
Oh, well.
Should I go ahead and share my screen?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. You guys all see the full screen?
Yes, we do.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure and an honor to be here today as part of this group. I'm so thrilled to have been, through this invitation, exposed to Karen's work. I unfortunately can't read French. And so I had not read the book, but I've become aware through this, preparing for this afternoon, that we have written very, very complementary pieces of work. So it's really, I think the organizers did a fantastic job of bringing us together, because I think there's a lot of synergies here, and I'm really excited to see where the discussion goes later on. But so my thought was today to just kind of give a little bit of an overview of the general argument, and then use the rest of the time to jump into one particular chapter, but I'll try to situate it within the whole. So I thought I'd start by giving just a little bit of background about what it is that led me to want to write this book, and sort of what really ended up becoming this axe that I wanted to grind in writing the book. And I had been thinking about a lot of these questions about categorization and refugee status determination for many years, but in the late summer and early fall of 2015, I was struck, as all of us were, by the large number of arrivals that were coming into Europe, many of whom were coming from the terrible civil war in Syria that had already been going on at that point for half a decade, and also people coming from other places as well. But the way in which that moment was really cast as a crisis for Europe, and the media response to that moment. And in particular, I was very troubled by this flurry of what I call explainer articles. So just about every news outlet you can imagine in these few weeks of 2015 ran the same article, basically, that said, what is the difference between a migrant and a refugee? The purpose of these articles seemed to be sort of a desire to understand, who is it that's really coming across the Mediterranean? Who is it that's arriving in Europe? The subtext, of course, is how much should we care, or how deserving should we view these people arriving as? And in particular, I think the world was very sort of shocked into awareness of the situation when there was a photo that I won't share that went viral of a toddler who had died and was dead on a beach, named Alan Kurdi. I think a lot of people were like, what's going on? And these articles sort of tried to answer the question, but to my mind were extremely unsatisfying. So they all followed the exact same format, which was to say, we need to know what the difference is. Here's the definition of a refugee from international law. Some of the people coming are refugees, a lot of them are not. And then that was kind of the end of the article, as if that helped us to understand what on earth should be done or could be done in this situation. So I thought a lot about this question in those months and started thinking about this. It sounds like much in the same way that Karen is thinking about it, in terms of this binary between migrant and refugee. And it became very clear in this period, but of course, it's sort of an ongoing feature of our public discourse and debate. But it became very clear that this is a very significant binary in the way that we talk about border crossers, not just politicians, but also advocates and also scholars in how they talk about border crossing. And so I wanted to explore the life of this binary and try to understand what is the underlying logic of this assumption that there's these two very different kinds of people who cross borders. And so in the introductory chapter to the book, I take on this question of binary logic, and I argue that it's based on three core assumptions. The first and foremost is that refugees and migrants have distinct and distinguishable motivations for crossing borders. And so what this means is this assumption suggests that when people show up and seek access to a process that's often known as refugee status determination, there's this belief that a process of regularized inquiry can be created that distinguishes, that sorts the wheat from the chaff, right? That says, that is able to distinguish between people who are truly refugees and people who are not. And that this process can be created in a way that is reliable. And when it fails, the goal is to perfect it, right? Because there's this assumption that a perfect version of this process can exist. The second prong of binary logic is that the reason why this process is justifiable is because refugees are the neediest amongst the world's border crossers, right? So we don't have to figure out who's needy amongst a group of people who are arriving. As long as we figure out whether or not they're refugees, that answers the question for us. And then the third prong that I've discovered in my journey through trying to understand this binary is the assumption that true refugees are rare, right? So that the sorting process is about finding the few among the many, that the vast majority of people who are going to be crossing borders are crossing borders for other reasons, for reasons that Karen already described, people who are motivated by economic opportunity, for people who are who don't have political motivations, right? And so the rare few are who these processes are designed to discover. So as I hope has become clear in my discussion of this, of these assumptions, is that binary logic is highly essentialist, right? It believes that there is this quality of refugee-ness that people either possess or they don't, and it can be discovered through this process. And it's also highly formal, right? Placing a lot of stock in legal definitions, making these categories seem natural, objective, and apolitical, therefore sidelining the really difficult ethical conversations in favor of, we just need to figure out who's who. The difficult discussions have happened back in some other period when we decided refugees were the priority. So the basic argument of the book is that if you actually look at all of the marvelous empirical work that's being done out there that I rely on heavily in the book of border crossing, we see that the binary is a legal fiction, right? It's a construction that's not necessarily accurate, right? It doesn't reflect the reality of the lived experience of border crossers, but rather it's treated as if it were true for the purposes of bureaucratic expediency and convenience. And I get this concept from the legal scholar Lon Fuller. But we know from all kinds of scholarly work that people cross borders for a myriad reasons. Their motivations are complex, they're multiple. We know that economic forces can be forces just like political ones. We add climate change to the mix, it gets even more complicated, but there isn't this very clear-cut binary of motivations when you actually interview people who are in the process of or who have crossed borders. So to explore the ubiquity and the persistence of the migrant-refugee binary, I use a critical refugee studies lens. And by that, I mean, I focus on questions of geopolitical power and colonial legacy to understand why this is such a dominant frame. And I build upon the work of many of these scholars here who I list up on the slide. And ultimately, I find that the migrant-refugee binary masks the ways in which categories have been politically constructed to elevate the suffering of some people over the suffering of others. And we'll talk more about that in a second. But I thought I would just briefly share the table of contents. So I just kind of gave you a whirlwind overview of the first chapter of the book. The second chapter takes a very historical view, looking at the way that the concept of a refugee evolved over time with a lot of parallels to Karen's book. And it's really looking at the role of colonialism in the development of the concept of a refugee. In chapter 3, I look at the way the binary has shaped and constrained the academic study of border crossers and really bifurcated it in ways that I think are detrimental to our understanding of border crossing. Chapter 4 looks at the role of the United Nations High Commissioner for refugees, and that's the chapter I'm going to dive into for the rest of our time together. And then I have 3 case study chapters, one looking at the life of the migrant refugee binary in the global South, particularly focused on the 2 biggest displacement crises in the world today, Syrians within the region of the Middle East and Venezuelans in Latin America, but also looking at historically the ways in which the migrant refugee binary has been experienced and enforced upon in some ways the global South. Then I have a chapter looking at arrivals in Europe and discourse of reactions in Europe to arrivals. And then a chapter on the US, which really compares the Obama administration to the Trump administration and finds some real parallels between the 2 in terms of a commitment to the binary. And then finally, a concluding chapter, which I'll hint at a little bit in a few minutes. So let's dive into chapter 4. This chapter really is trying to explore why UNHCR is such a prominent figure in the perpetuation of and the promotion of the migrant refugee binary. And when I tell you that it is a promoter of the binary, it really is consistently over many, many years, a huge proponent of the binary. And I'm only going to be able to give you a little bit of a flavor of that story here today. But first of all, what I started doing to try to understand this was to collect up public relations material where UNHCR talks about this issue. And we see, as early as 2005, you see Erica Feller, who was the director of the protection division, wrote a whole article, the title of which was "Refugees Are Not Migrants," explaining why refugees are very distinct and importantly distinct category of border crossers. Similarly, in 2017, Volker Turk, the Assistant High Commissioner, argued in a public speech that it's inappropriate to present refugees as a subset of anyone else, migrant or otherwise. A person who's a refugee is a refugee, full stop. Blurring the distinction between refugees and migrants undermines the specific legal protections to which refugees are entitled. So here you get a little bit of a sense that it seems to UNHCR that it's important for them to do the work that they do to protect refugees if this distinction is really sharp. The image on the left is an example of one of the visuals that I collected in my research. It's the cover of Refugees magazine, which is the internal publication of UNHCR. This is from 2007. And this image just really kind of stopped me in my tracks. It was one of those moments in my research process where I was like, wow, I really want to write this book. As you can see, it's in the book in black and white, but I feel like the color image is so much more striking. It's a Black man in the water, grappling, holding tightly to what looks like a rescue boat. And I don't know, I can't quite tell from the picture whether the person is a Haitian person in the Caribbean Sea trying to enter the United States, or an African person, a sub-Saharan African person trying to enter Europe in the Mediterranean. But either way, once that person is pulled into the boat, if they're assessed, if they go through the process of refugee status determination, everything we know about the past several decades of these policies is that that person has a fairly low chance of being granted refugee status. And superimposed over this very powerful and striking image is this question again that we saw in the explainer articles, refugee or migrant, why it matters. And to me, this is a really evocative example of UNHCR's commitment to the binary, but also just, it strikes me that that question is actually one of the least important questions in that particular moment. I just want to share with you a little bit more. What I was then drawn to do was starting to really look at their UNHCR's social media presence because it's quite active. I don't know how many of you follow UNHCR on Twitter, but they have more than 2.5 million followers. They also have a massive following on Facebook, Instagram, and also Pinterest. And what I started to do was I started collecting their tweets about the migrant refugee binary. And I created a database of of their tweets over several years, which didn't end up being a particularly interesting database because all of their tweets on this topic are exactly the same. So here's just 3 examples. September 3rd, 2015 is actually the morning after the picture of Alan Kurdi's body went viral around the world. UNHCR tweeted, "Refugees or migrants, what is right?" with a link to an explainer article about the definition of a refugee. Similarly, in March 2016, there's a crucial difference between refugees and migrants. Learn more, a link to an explainer. Confused about who's a refugee and who's a migrant? Our FAQs will help. Again, a link to an explainer. There's a lot more examples like this, not a lot of variation. Just one more example though, because this one's really interesting to me. This is from 2019. This is from UNHCR's Instagram page. It's a 2-image set. The first image says, who is a refugee and who is a migrant? What is the difference between a refugee and a migrant? And then the second image says, mixing these terms can cause problems. What's left for the imagination is sort of what problems. So after collecting so much of this kind of stuff, I thought I need to understand more. And I reached out, and UNHCR's communications team and social media team very graciously hosted me for, I went for a full business week to Geneva. I was there every day, Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, and interviewed almost every member of the team, in some cases multiple times, for very long periods of time. I went to the cafeteria, had coffee with people, sort of shadowed, and I felt like I got a much better sense by the end of that week of what was going on. And so I'm going to share that with you now. One of the communications staffers I spoke to explained to me that around 2014 or 2015, we gained an awareness that we have a different role to play. We've always done quiet advocacy, diplomacy with governments, but we realized we needed to be more present at the grassroots level to be a trusted voice. We don't have a presence in the West on the ground like we do in some countries. So the social media, was a way to have presence. So this quote helped me to understand that UNHCR's massive investment in social media over the past few years is aimed at reaching people like you and me, reaching people who are citizens of or residents of wealthy global North states, the states that are funding UNHCR and the states that are resettling refugees. UNHCR has massively expanded since 2014, its social media team. They have 8 full-time social media staff in Geneva, a full-time person in almost all of their field offices, and they've done social media training for hundreds and hundreds of staff members around the world to help them learn how to take appropriate photos that fit their goals and share them. So this is something that UNHCR is deliberately doing, and they are investing a lot in it with this very clear goal in mind of reaching out to us directly. They told me we do a lot of really strategic outreach based on a lot of research. A huge part of it is dispelling stereotypes with stories. So we know there's hostility and xenophobia. And so we want to tell stories about how refugees are integrating, working, learning the language, getting involved in their communities. So here we see that UNHCR is concerned about assuaging some sort of anxiety, some fear, some hostility in the global North, convincing people like us not to be afraid, not to be resistant about admitting refugees into our countries, because refugees are not threatening. They're actually contributing, they're integrating, etc. So here's just one more quote. I asked, so why do you need all these explainer articles? Like, why do you tweet out so much about the difference in the definition? And they said, we know we need explainers because of the questions that come in on the comments. There's a lot of confusion about definitions. We think a lot about the anxious middle, which was such a helpful study, and about reachable audiences. So the anxious middle is something that I think every single person I interviewed mentioned to me. It's a study out of the UK that basically argued that there's this percentage on the far sort of end of the spectrum that will never be open to any kind of newcomer, and a percentage at the other end that's very open, no matter what. But the vast majority of people who are citizens of global North receiving states are convincible. They're in the middle. They have a lot of concerns and fears about immigration, but if you convince them that the immigrants we're talking about are not threatening, they're not a security risk, they're willing to integrate, they're not going to be too threatening or scary, they might be open to it. And UNHCR communication staff really glommed onto this study and really, really wants to use their social media platform to convince people like us in the global North not to be afraid of refugees. So why? So let's link that back to the question of why is UNHCR so committed to the binary as a kind of operational ideology? And I learned from my research that it's really concerned about the populist turn in donor states with good reason. I was there during the Trump administration, and several people mentioned that they were afraid the whole budget of UNHCR could be wiped out in a single tweet. The agency, therefore, was highly motivated to protect their authority on refugee issues so that they could stay relevant and continue to have the capacity to assist vulnerable people, right? They don't just want to keep existing for the sake of it. It's very mission driven. And to do this, UNHCR insists on the particularity of the refugee. And this particularity is appealing because it reassures the majority of voters in donor states that refugees are not a threat, because obligations to refugees don't extend to every border crosser. It's really important here to make this distinction. In sum, binary logic helps UNHCR illustrate the humanity of refugees while defining refugees as a distinct group, not the hordes of migrants that global North publics might be worried about. So how does this link back to the larger argument? I argue that building empathy for refugees by insisting that they're uniquely deserving of concern and emphasizing the importance of sorting them from other border crossers is going to have unintended consequences. Such frames allow powerful states to sidestep the most difficult political discussions about the ethics of border control by suggesting that harsh measures are just so long as they make some rare exceptions for refugees. The binary, therefore, serves to assure us that real refugees will rise to the top of draconian sorting processes, leaving undeserving migrants below. So now I'm jumping to just a couple points from my concluding chapter. I suggest in that chapter that to move beyond binary logic, we have to move away from these tug of war advocacy arguments about whether or not people trying to cross borders are refugees. You see pro-refugee advocates making these arguments a lot, and I think that they are counterproductive because they fall into this trap, this essentialist trap. Instead, I argue we should acknowledge the difficulty of the situation at hand, have the difficult conversations about precisely how much violence we are willing to tolerate to protect our privilege, face up to questions of responsibility and accountability regarding the global North's role in causing displacement and instability through colonialism, neo-colonial global capitalism, and military intervention. I haven't talked too much about those things in this particular overview, but they're a big theme in the book. And finally, I argue that we should think of the Refugee Convention as just one tool in a larger toolkit and continue to imagine new and complementary forms of protection. So I'll leave it there. Please email me if you want to reach out, or follow me on Twitter, or buy the book if you want. Okay, I'll stop sharing now.
Okay, thank you, Rebecca. Roger, you have 10 minutes for comment.
Okay, terrific. A second. Okay, so as organizers of this colloquium series, David and I usually take the approach of seeking out an expert colleague to offer thoughts on the books that we discuss. And in general, this strikes me as a wise approach. Pulling the series together is indeed honest labor, and there isn't any need for us to go overboard by adding another task to already overburdened shoulders. But unfortunately, wisdom often eludes me. And so in this case, I jumped at the chance to comment on these two books for two reasons. First, they address important questions that I've been increasingly pondering over the past few years. As we've heard, the events of the past decade have made these issues a matter of inescapable concern for any self-respecting migration scholar. And at the same time, I've wondered why, given my own personal connection to the phenomenon at hand, I've neglected it. So reflecting on these two very stimulating books, even in the context of a very busy academic quarter, has turned out to be a welcome opportunity to advance my own thinking. Now, I'll enter into substance in a moment, but before doing so, I think that David and I can pat ourselves on the shoulder for bringing these two books to our audience's attention, since doing so allows us to push beyond the limitations of so much US migration scholarship. For most American scholars, the relevant phenomenon remains that of, quote, immigration, that is to say, what happens after migration. That for US scholars, that has the approach of the convenience of allowing the researchers to focus on the place where they themselves live and work, and thus implicitly treats the US as if it were the natural center of the world. Now, one would think that scholars concerned with refugees would chafe at these limitations, since the concept is inherently linked to circumstances impinging not at the place of destination, but rather at origin. But in fact, the great bulk of relevant American scholarship is concerned with so-called refugee integration, focusing on those groups that the US has designated as refugees and therefore has chosen to resettle. And in doing so, the literature has allowed state policy rather than the conditions of exit to define the boundaries of the population in question, rendering invisible the persons who leave for the same reason but receive different treatment upon arrival. Now, the sins of American scholarship are compounded by its complacent monolingualism. Taking for granted the very linguistic hegemony, it should question, as if nothing written in a language other than English deserved attention. But what US scholars ignore is their deficiency relative to their non-American counterparts, who, as we've heard from Karen, are entirely up to date with what we are doing, but continue to talk to themselves in their native language. And inattention to non-English scholarship is all the more regrettable as our digital age makes work written in another tongue very accessible. Anyone interested in reading Karen's book just has to go to Amazon and it downloads in a second. Now, hopefully, an enlightened university press will see fit to publish a translation, since drawing on deep immersion in the archives, alongside extensive in-depth interviews, Karen has succeeded in getting inside the black box of the immigration bureaucracy, doing so in ways that have thus far eluded almost all US migration scholars. Now, one of the striking aspects of reading these two books alongside each other is the degree to which they sound a similar note, even though the authors seem to be, at least at the time of writing, utterly unaware of one another. So I read both books in digital form so I could easily do a search for names. And one reads, goes through Rebecca's book and puts in Karen Akoka, you put in Rebecca into Karen's book, and neither one shows up. And what's striking, and this is actually confirmed by Rebecca's presentation, the very first sentence in Karen's book, in which where she discusses the controversy launched by Al Jazeera not to employ the term migrants to describe persons then crossing the Mediterranean. And that converges, as we've heard, with the core argument of Rebecca's book. Now, both authors enter the debate that splits the study of refugees in very similar ways. The classical view contends that the refugee concept denotes a distinctive phenomenon to be found in the world, one that reflects a very specific set of circumstances that make movement a matter of compulsion, not choice, and for that very reason, affect the characteristics of the people who manage to find the path to safety. Now, both Rebecca and Karen explicitly reject that point of view. Instead, they insist that the refugee concept simply references a name, one that bears little or no relationship to an underlying difference between one class of migrants or the other. For them, the refugee concept entails little more than a nominal concept, a politically assigned label imposed from the outside. As indicated in the subtitle of Rebecca's book, it's all a matter of label. Karen begins in exactly the same way. She explicitly invokes the labeling theory developed by Howard Becker as a way of unveiling the underlying dynamics of what law and convention called deviance. And Karen contends that, quote, a refugee is simply a person to whom the quality has been assigned, end quote. Now, all the while pushing back against what she calls the binary logic that divides movers into migrants and refugees, which in turn attributes an essentialist quality to each, Rebecca does note that motivations to move can differ widely, with some of a largely or even entirely voluntary nature and others principally responding to compulsion. Yet, even if there may be a continuum of motivations, the modified realist view associated with the concept of sociological refugee, Rebecca contends, proves inadequate to the complexity of migration motivations and circumstances. Now, I note that this modified version of the realist view concedes that political considerations may be the principal influence, may be the principal influence affecting application of the label. But this view still maintains that a conceptual distinction between forced and voluntary migrants can be found. Now, Karen won't have it. She writes, quote, under scientific guise, the substitution of sociological judgments to those of the institution participates in reinforcing the dichotomy between refugees and migrants rather than deconstructing it, end quote. Now, although both authors reject the dichotomy, Rebecca, as we've heard, insists that it does a great deal of work. Language takes on, quote, tremendous political importance, since when it is used by the state, binary essentialism can become a very dangerous game, end quote. And precisely for that reason, as we've heard, Rebecca offers a new concept altogether, quote, border crosser, one that presumably has blanket application to anyone crossing state boundaries, regardless of the motivation or the legal category applied to them at the moment of encountering the new state border. Now, I understand, I sympathize with the author's motivation, but I think they push their skepticism too far. And to begin with, the sociological realism that Zollberg developed 30 years ago and that David and Rowan Rara have taken up in their new and terrific manuscript that everyone will have to read once it's published, it identifies a central lacuna, I think, in thinking about migration more generally. And if you think about theories of migration, whether they come from neoclassical economics, social network theory, segmented labor theory, world system theory, they all fundamentally assume that the underlying process is the same, regardless of whether the migrations are internal, that is within the boundaries of a country, or international, going across boundaries. And by contrast, what is, I think, distinctive about sociological realism is that it puts the political at the very center of the explanation. That is to say, it's politics that both generates the pressures that lead to expulsion, that lead to people leaving, and at the same time, yields the conditions that either prompt the possible states of destination to accept the people fleeing violence or to reject it. Now, to make politics central to the phenomenon is not to say that forced or refugee migration applies only to the politically persecuted and no others, but it's to say something different. That is to say that politics lies behind the forces propelling exit. And those forces might take the form of policies that strip an elite of its privileges. It may take the form of policies that end food subsidies or open agricultural markets to foreign competitions impacting peasants. Or it might take the form of politics that deprive a state of its capacity to provide basic security, or maybe turn it into an instrument of crime, which is a way to describe what's happening in the Northern Triangle. Now, now here I'm going to address myself more directly to Rebecca's book. It seems to me that border crossing and international migration are clearly not the same. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of border crossing, but much, much less international migration. Now, here's an example. In 2018, there were 1.4 billion international tourist arrivals. Now, that represents a 56-fold increase since 1950 and a 31% increase since 2008. Now, I'll concede, arrivals and persons are not the same. And undoubtedly, the number of individuals traveling for the purpose of tourism was well below the 1.4 billion. But let's be generous and say, okay, not 1.4 billion, but 10% of that represents the number of people traveling. That's 140 million people, way, way, way above the total, way above the number of people migrating in the kind of conventional sense. Now, if you take the conventional UN definition of an international migrant, someone who spent at least a year outside of the country of birth, there were 9 million people who entered the OECD countries in 2017. Now, that's 9 million as compared to a population of 1.3 billion, right? And that's at a time when the citizens of the OECD are thinking, says, oh, migration is out of control. But in fact, in relative terms, it's very slight. So, I mean, my point is that there's an awful lot of border crossing. Most of it is circular. It doesn't create a problem. And there's a lot less migration. So I think there is a phenomenon there that for which we need a distinctive concept. Now, I mean, the other point is that many border crossers, both temporary and permanent, are wanted. What's striking, of course, is that states want migrants of some kind and don't want migrants of others. So, I mean, I have a book written by a French sociologist. So let's think a little bit about the French case. I mean, French economists have shown that France's restrictive migration policies have negative effects on French economic growth. But French politicians are falling all over themselves to show who can put the hardest line on immigration. I mean, what they're saying is mind-boggling. But they can't wait until mass tourism revives. So some border crossers are welcome and others clearly aren't. Now, obviously, it's difficult to define the precise line where voluntary migration shades over into compelled. It's really a hopeless measure, I think. But still, it's possible to identify persons who stand at the two ends of the continuum. Countries, one second. So, I mean, at one end, the voluntary, we can think about international students. I mean, again, a population of migrants that has doubled since the beginning of the 21st century. So that's a much greater increase than for overall migration. And there's a worldwide scramble for international students. And that implies that these are also people who have very, the scope for choice is greatly increased. Now, at the compelled end, there are countless people who face an unbearable pressure to flee. Now, many, of course, don't flee because they can't. And of course, contacts make a difference. But a large body of research shows that exposure to violence matters, with effects that emerge when violence is measured at an aggregate level, or whether at an individual level, or whether violence takes the form of threat, or whether violence has actually physically been inflicted. And we also know that when violence subsides, so too does movement. So I think there's every reason to think that there is something distinctive about migration impelled by violence. And in saying that, I'm saying that the populational phenomenon in question goes well beyond the ambit described in the Geneva Convention. Now, I want to turn to another theme that is raised by these two books, and namely that language matters. And it seems to me that's an argument that plays an especially important role in Rebecca's book, as I said, and I believe as she just told us, she ascribes a great deal of power to the migrant-refugee binary. As, and here I'll quote her, it possesses the capacity to shape and constrain, that's her word, academic study, global governance institutions, and policy debate. But is it the case that language, in particular what Rebecca has described as, quote, the Eurocentric definition of the Geneva Convention, quote, a long quote, with its essentialist rhetoric that casts suspicion on the claims of those who do not fit legally within, is it really the case that that language yields the force to which Rebecca ascribes it? Now, based on my reading of Karen's book, it seems to me the answer is no, because what she shows is that the label is highly laid by. It's highly mutable. As she points out, I mean, here I'm really quoting her, the Geneva Convention constitutes a fluid text, and that can be interpreted as political or economic interests dictate. And what makes France such a great case is that it adopted, or it assented to the Geneva Convention right from the very beginning, as opposed to the US, which waited 2 decades. Now, she points out that neither the date of the event nor the location proved much of a constraint. So in the middle of the 1950s, the Western powers decided that's a great idea. Let's admit the Hungarians, wonderful weapon in our struggle with the Soviet Union. The problem is the precipitating event occurred in 1956, not 1951. So they decided, never mind. The real roots occurred in World War II. So we'll admit these people as refugees, and we'll pretend that they meet the needs of the convention. So a different case that would be less known to most people. Portugal, of course, was a dictatorship, and Portuguese came to France in search of safe haven. But France had friendly relationships with Portugal, so they didn't want to admit these people as refugees. So how do you justify that? Well, actually, the Salazar regime, again, in the official parlance, Salazar regime is an event that occurred after the adoption of the convention. So convention doesn't protect these people, when of course the Salazar regime had its origins much earlier. Nor was location really a matter. So after the Suez War, Jews fled Egypt, and for foreign policy reasons, France concluded it would be acceptable. It would be useful to admit them. So who cares about the territorial definition? And I guess one can ask, at least this is the question I asked myself in reading Rebecca's book, that if language is so constraining, and in fact the language that we have had such negative effects, was it the case that people fleeing violence were better off before the individualizing terms of the convention were adopted? Now, in the 1930s, several 100,000 persons who we now customarily classify as refugees arrived in the United States in flight from fascism. But after the fact, we say, well, these people fit both the sociological and the legal definition of refugees, but in reality, they were admitted as plain old immigrants. And for the most part, they comprised a highly selected population that was chosen on the basis of criteria that high and low level bureaucrats thought would be vital to US interests. Now, I want to make another point, and that is that if we compare now and then, I think we can see that recognition of an obligation to accept refugees. And I think that obligation would seem inseparable, but I can't imagine that you could have an obligation that would be somehow separate from identifying any population question. It's not simply a constraint, but it's a tool for opening doors to persons who would otherwise be excluded. Now, we went through terrible times between 2016 and 2020, but one of the better aspects of those times was witnessing the extraordinary protests that arose against the Trump immigration policy of the Trump administration, especially the policies having to do with child separation. But if we went to in historical perspective, what's striking is that those demonstrations represent something new. I mean, to the best of my knowledge, I might be wrong, but there were no similar protests when the St. Louis was turned around in 1938 and sent back to Europe with hundreds of refugees on board. It was widely publicized, it wasn't a secret, but no one at that point was ready to stand in the public place and say, this is the wrong thing to do. And I think if you think about the protests that were ignited by the Trump administration, that they really represent the latest episode in the now several decades long history of mobilization that designed to expand the scope of asylum, and it's done so successfully. I mean, obviously, much less successfully than one would want, but has done much more than any administration would like. Now, I want to give an example, and that has to do with the NACARA, the Nicaraguan Adjustment and Central American Relief Act, which was passed in 1997. It was written in a very restricted way, but in fact, it was implemented generously. I'm going to quote now Susan Coutinho, an expert anthropologist at Unhcr, right? And she says, passage of the act and its implementation, quote, caused an immigrant group previously defined as economic migrants to be considered deserving of protection because of the lives that they had created in the United States and the circumstances in which they left their country of origin, end quote. In the end, 200,000 people who were entered without authorization, who were impelled by violence, were legalized under the NACARA with approval rates close to 95%. So I think what we have to ask ourselves is, could such an outcome have been possible without the view that some particular subset of border crossers were worthy of special protection? I mean, maybe, but I don't think so. Now, in the end, it seems to me that rejection of the migrant-refugee binary leads both Rebecca and Karen to advocate something that, to my ears at any rate, sounds like open borders. According to Rebecca, and here I'll quote, a full accounting of the work that the migrant-refugee binary has done over time would call into question the legitimacy of exclusionary border control practices, end quote. She advocates non-binary slogans such as no ban, no wall, or all are welcome. Karen tells us that what truly menaces the institution of asylum are the policies of immigration restriction, contending that, quote, a true right of asylum can never exist without policies of open immigration, end quote. Now, that proposition actually flows out of her empirical analysis because she shows in a very interesting way that during the guest worker era, that is from 1945 to 1973, the state in France had the flexibility of essentially sorting between the refugee regime and the guest worker regime, and according refugee status to those people when it would meet state interests, and letting other people who were also fleeing violence and persecution become guest workers when that was the easier course of action. So consequently, she sees, quote, the politics of asylum and of immigration is structurally interconnected, and their opening is the only way out of the impasse that leads the people charged with protecting asylum against the people seeking asylum itself. Now, it's written in a very striking, almost poetic. Now, it's hard not to sympathize with the proponents of open borders. And in many ways, I think it's more easily defended and it's more inherently appealing than a communitarian point of view. Open borders gives priority to human freedom, and communitarianism yields a level of illiberalism that takes ever more egregious forms all over the world. And that seems to be an inevitable result of the effort to keep most people out and select the ones. But I'm not convinced, to be frank, and I'd be interested to hear what the authors say, that they're really ready for a full-throated defense of open borders. Now, Rebecca doesn't rail against the narrowness of the convention, but in doing so, she's very eager to, I think, widen the category of persons to whom protection may be provided. Karen does make the point that yesterday's refugee regime was better than today's, but I'm not certain that she's also simultaneously advocating a return to a guest worker regime, although I do think that a more flexible and expanded immigration system with more opportunities for guest workers would actually provide more protection for asylum seekers and refugees. But if we think about the guest worker system of old, that is the one that Karen so ably describes, I don't think it's accurate to call it open migration. I mean, right from the immediate post-war days, as Karen knows, France's immigration policy was designed to be selective. I mean, policymakers, and they were explicit about that, had a very clear idea of the types of immigrants that they wanted. It's Northern Europeans at the top of the pile, Southern Europeans at the middle, North Africans and other persons from the empire down at the bottom. Now that system allowed for Portuguese fleeing repression to find safety as unauthorized workers and then transition to legal status. But without the perception that the Portuguese were preferable to North Africans, it's unlikely that this portal to protection would have ever emerged. So, okay, I've used up too much of my time. So let me say in conclusion, I have organized many Author Meets Critic sessions, and in doing so, I've always admonished commentators to remember that these are sessions in which authors meet a critic, not a flatterer. Now, I'll readily concede that in today's session, I probably have taken my advice too hard. But it's also the case that serious criticism is the best compliment that anyone can pay an author. And that especially applies to these two authors who have written important and stimulating books from which I've learned a great deal and which I enthusiastically recommend to the audiences that has joined us for this event. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Roger. So sadly, we don't have time for a point-by-point response from each of the authors, but maybe you could pick up one or two of the questions and give a brief response, and then we'll open things up. And we'll start first with you, Karen, and then over to Rebecca.
So how much time I have? 1, 5, 3?
I'll say up to 5 minutes.
Okay, it's going to be hard. I think you're asking two different kinds of questions. I mean, it's an amazing, it's very important questions you're asking, but in some way, I think you're asking questions on two very different levels, which are, you're asking me a question as an academic on the difference of categories, and a question as like more as a citizen or as a person with political views on what would be the good system, which is not exactly the same. And so on the binary, I don't have really so much time, but I do stick to the idea that there is a binary that is politically constructed, and maybe I can say things here I didn't say in the description, but I go through the history of how definitions has changed to show that, if definitions change all the time, what is the reality of the content? And then I go into, when we have one definition, which is the Geneva Conventions, how the interpretation changes all the time. And for me, this shows how the content is made by those who label, and more than by the identities of those who are labeled. And then and a last point that I want to make that we didn't discuss here, many times we hear that it's difficult because people, they migrate for a mixture of political and economic reasons. This is why we cannot distinguish. This argument is okay. I don't think it's the strongest one. For me, a very strong argument is the mere differentiation between politics and economy. And then I go back to Karl Polanyi's work on the very liberal ideology that create this fiction of economy as a different sphere autonomy, but that has its autonomy from the political sphere. But I think this is a very interesting way to question the binary, not only to say inside the motivation there is a mix, but to say what is this idea of differentiating economy as something different than politics. And I think that, well, I don't have enough time, but taking all these things all together, so yes, there is a continuum. Yes, there are people that are very strong at the sides of the continuum, but I think most of people fall in this in this difficulty of distinction between individual, collective, forced, voluntary, and political and economics, which with this idea of if it's behind the separation, there is a very political strong stance. And this is why I think the refugee category is a very political category. And if it's a very political category, I think it speaks much more about how it's constructed than trying to look into the lives of people and trajectory to understand if they're refugees and migration is an impasse to me. Specifically, even more so when there are two so different regimes of immigration and refugee. Because then you go into the real and fake question, which was not so strong at the time I tried to speak of, and I think it's very interesting that the paradigm of real and fake comes in at a time where there is only this one option. And then there is the question, and then I have to go very quick. And then there is this whole other question. That for me, it's not addressed. It's not an academic question, but it's an important question. But it doesn't come to how do you say contradict my vision of non-binary. The fact that is it good or not open? What regime should be there? And when I say, when I say open immigration, when I say that you can't have a just asylum regime without an open immigration regime, I'm not saying of a regime of opening wide the borders, but I'm saying that since the categories are very fluid, you need also regimes that are fluid enough to reflect this fluidity of the categories. And then it's true that I'm not a designer of political policies, so I can't come up with a good solution on this question of opening borders, but at least I don't know. I drive on what I work with as an academic, and then at what point I say it specifically in the book. From my point of view, at one point I take a point of view that's not academic, and I think it's very important to show when you change hats. And I think it's a very big problem with academics believing too much in these categories because they keep the same hats somehow. And so with the other with another hat, I could say that I don't have a very good answer to your question of what should we do with this dilemma. But it doesn't come to contradict the idea of continuum, of rigidification of this category that doesn't reflect anymore in nothing. Yes, that reflects merely the politics behind it, the politics of labeling. So that's how I can finish. there is much more to say to all your very rich comments.
Thank you. Rebecca.
Sure. Well, now I'm just all the more motivated to go and take Roger's advice and get the translation of your book and read it immediately, because it sounds like we have a lot in common. And Roger, I just really so deeply appreciate this engagement. It's exactly the kind of engagement that I dreamed of when I wrote this book. So I'm thrilled. And there's not enough time to talk about all of the brilliant points you made. But I'll just say two main things, I guess. The first is about this question of a continuum and the point that the ends of the spectrum can be distinguished from one another. I agree with that. What I don't think, the thing that I don't agree with is that I think we're talking about multiple continua, and I don't think that they layer and map onto one another. And so, yes, for an individual continuum, you can find the ends of the spectrum. But what part of the critique of the migrant refugee binary is this idea that the continuum of forced and voluntary is layered upon and matches precisely with a continuum between needy and self-sufficient, or vulnerable and not vulnerable, or economically motivated and politically motivated. And what I'm trying to do is pull those things apart, because I think when we assume they layer onto one another, it's easier to imagine the fact that we can distinguish the ends of the spectrum than I think is really possible. And I think a couple more points to make on that. The first is, it's led me into a new project that is not discussed at all in the book, but I've been working on a project about a very different kind of sorting process, which is the efforts of global North states to prevent providing safe haven to what they consider to be war criminals and human rights violators. And on paper, that's a group that we can all agree we don't want to admit, right? That's the easy exception to any kind of critique of border control policy. But in reality, what I've learned in this process is it's very, very difficult to actually create a sorting process that keeps out the bad guys, just as it is very, very difficult to create a process that admits the quote unquote good guys. And so I think a big part of what I'm trying to do here is get us to think more critically and question the processes, the bureaucratic processes that are being created, and whether they match onto the language that we're using. So that leads me to my second point. You're asking about whether I'm advocating in the book for open borders. I don't explicitly do that. That's not the aim of the book. I think if you're a person who is already on board with the idea of open borders, there's a lot of grist for your mill in the book, but that's not that's not the agenda here. I'm trying to meet people kind of where they're at. And if they're not there, I think there's also a lot of grist for your mill as well. And what I would say that instead of arguing for open borders, what I'm trying to say is that the migrant refugee binary, it lives so large in our imaginations. And the fact that we let it do that enables us to be more comfortable with the extremely violent work that borders do. And so what I'm trying to do is point out the way in which the binary masks or makes borders more palatable. And I think if we pull that away, we end up having to have much more difficult conversations that I think lead us to question a lot of what we're doing in terms of border control. That doesn't necessarily mean they go away altogether. So I'll just leave it at that. I don't know how much time we have for questions, but.
Yeah, no, we have, up to maybe 30 minutes if people can stay on for questions. So lots of folks on the call, please raise your hand or post your question in the Q&A. Esperanza.
Yes, hi, I'm Esperanza Camargo. Sorry, I cannot, I don't have camera, but I want to make this question because I think it is this dichotomy, the discussion about the dichotomy migrant refugee is very important. And I just, my question is for Rebecca, if when we try to identify phenomena in social sciences, we try to understand what it is. And I think it is different to be a migrant when, you know, you basically voluntarily, or at least with much more possibility to make decisions, you migrate, than the refugee condition, which is much more a forced migration. And it has a different condition. So when you say that migrant and refugee make the dichotomy, is somehow hidden the vulnerability of this population. I think that migrants and refugees have different levels of vulnerability. They are different populations, and their vulnerability is different. So I just want to know, well, both Karen and Rebecca, what do you think about this kind of hidden, the problematic, the problem that it stays that to hit the migrant refugee specificity, let's say.
Thank you.
So I guess here I would just try to be more clear about the way in which we're using the word refugee. So if we're talking about people who have gained refugee status, of course, many of them are people who have very good reasons for achieving that status. They've, of course, experienced great vulnerability. As Roger points out, there is something very real about the experience of fleeing violence. That is without question in my mind, and not what I'm trying to say. I'm not trying to say that there's that all migration experiences are equivalent in any way. But I do think that it's important to distinguish that legal protective status from a much more broad way that we often use the word refugee to refer to people who may or may not ever have a hope of achieving refugee status. But also, when we talk about people who are fleeing violence and are extremely vulnerable, only a very small number of those people are ever going to achieve the protective status that you're talking about. And so I think what I'd like to do is just try to decouple some of the, like, pull apart these threads so that we're more clear about who we're talking about and what we're talking about. And if violence is the thing that we're really worried about, being more clear about that. If political persecution is the thing that we're wanting to prioritize above all else, just being way more transparent about that. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I don't know if Karen wants to jump in.
Sorry, just one follow-up is in my research in Central American migration, like El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, we can't say, I think, that forced migration is also economic migration. It's not that it is not poverty, about talking about poverty level or the line, right? It is almost severe or chronic poverty. And I think in that sense, that socioeconomic status forced people to migrate. Not only political violence, not only violence, but the fact that people, the poor has less possibility to fight, the violence or other stressors that they can face. Sorry, thank you.
I mean, I think we agree, if I understand you correctly. I think we agree that people can be compelled by economic forces. They can be compelled, they can be in absolute states of desperation and have no hope of achieving the legal protective status of refugee. So yeah.
Okay, so we have several questions here, and I'll invite the participants to be succinct. Let's start with Angela McLean.
Hi, thank you so much for your wonderful presentations. This question is for Rebecca and your focus on the chapter on UNHCR in today's presentation specifically. I was just wondering, the goals of the UNHCR or the advocates that use the binary depiction of refugees/migrants, I believe, are very different from perhaps the book's goals, which perhaps are to encourage scholars and policymakers and even advocates to have a more difficult conversation, like you said, about responsibility and accountability of the global north vis-a-vis the production of displacement. But on a more practical and maybe policy implementation level, the UNHCR and the advocates' immediate goals is to really strike resonance with the existing adherents or attract new supporters, as you said, among the anxious middle in the global north, so that they could get more donations or more moral support to be able to continue their work. So perhaps without the usage of the refugee migrant binary, some may worry that achieving this kind of practical level, more functional goals would be very difficult. So I guess my question for you is, how could we balance out the more practical goals of the UNHCR with what your arguments are in the book about moving beyond the binary? So I mean, I don't know if you've talked to the advocates and UNHCR staff about this on striking this difficult balance.
So your question is about sort of if I were advising UNHCR on how to approach this matter differently, what would I suggest? Like, how would I suggest that they approach this matter? Is that kind of, I mean, I guess if I could make one particular intervention, I would prefer to see them step away from the binary essentialism that is a deep-rooted commitment in the agency. There's this line in their handbook that says, you know, people are refugees whether or not they are ever found to be a refugee. And I'm not, and that permeates the agency from top to bottom, right? This belief that there's this essential quality. And I guess I don't know if that is necessarily as useful of a frame as I think they believe it is. I think saying we're talking about extremely vulnerable people, all of them deserve to have a fair assessment of their claims for protective status. I don't see why that is inherently a less effective advocacy strategy than saying these people are refugees. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but I think that the language could be slightly more nuanced. And I guess to link back to a point that Roger made, I think, you know, we have seen a shift in very recent years towards less essentialist conversations in some advocacy circles. And I'm very pleased and heartened by that. But I guess I would suggest that to the extent that that shift has happened, it's been despite the prevalence and commitment to the migrant refugee binary. That's still the dominant frame in advocacy circles, not because of it, right? It's been actually a resistance to that that's developed in social movements that I look forward to seeing how it pans out.
Okay, Sara Bietza.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm very intrigued by this whole conversation. It's very much related to my own research, and I've been in the field more from a very grassroots perspective on always calling for open borders and trying to bring that into the academic world as well. I think it's very interesting to see how your both of your works kind of, as already was said, are complementary. And I was thinking especially about the Syrian case and how the German bureaucracy would apply subsidiary protection, not granting refugee status to people coming from Syria, but just making the process a lot faster. And that is kind of what I think, Karen, what you analyzed in the historic of review of what happens in the French case. But then I think in this case, there is a bureaucratic distinction between these very different categories that you're not so much discussing in the books. And I wonder how you would frame that in future works, for example, because I think the Unhcr is a very specific case and they have a very great interest, and they are very much contributing to creating vulnerabilities. If we look on their work in Lesbos and the Moria refugee camp that they are hosting, and putting people in positions that make them in need of very high treatment afterwards, medical and psychological treatment, all that stuff. So I wonder if you had conversations about the impact of the work on the ground, and then how you would discuss these very different categories of subsidiary protection, refugee protection, humanitarian protection. There are so many different statuses that people can be granted when they are in vulnerable positions, how you would relate that in your works. Thank you so much. It's very, very interesting.
Karen, do you have a response? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I cannot answer too much on the work on the ground, but you know, there is this very interesting article of Roger Zetter that's called "More Labels, Fewer Refugees," and I think it's a very interesting view of the idea that you know, when you create scarcity, you say scarcity, rareness, and so then you have to invent all kinds of labels in order to fill in some of this scarcity. But and for me, this temporary protection and even this idea of the vulnerability work is a lot going in this direction of more labels, fewer refugees. So and maybe it's the opportunity to say one word regarding the former question about because it's also about vulnerability, asking, but refugees are more vulnerable than migrants, aren't they? For me, this question doesn't really. I mean, the answer is no. Some people are more vulnerable than others, but I don't see that someone. I don't see that, you know, for someone leaving Senegal more because he's dying of hunger, partly because of politics of the global north towards fishing and subvention of Western food in Senegal that creates this hunger, and that he comes to Europe going through Libya. I don't see first that he's more vulnerable than someone who's fleeing war, and I don't see that there is something less political in his flight than someone fleeing war. You know, there's this very good sentence saying that migration is voting with your foot, and so I think all these things help us to get away from this idea of some are more vulnerable than other, and behind this idea there is the idea, and we have to help the more vulnerable and we have no other option than the less vulnerable. We can't help them and let them die in their countries. So it's a way of answering both questions.
Lori Hart.
Thank you. Let me put my hand down. Thank you all three of you for these amazing presentations and books. I think it really adds flesh to sort of general sort of opposition to this polarity. And now with, the kind of historical and social information that you're providing, it does a lot for all of us to be able to draw on that. So that's the first, thank you. And I have one specific question and one sort of general sort of thought question. And the specific question is for Karen, whether or not she could say more about France's complicated relationship to its former colonies. I found the comments that you were making on that really interesting. And since that relationship has varied so much over time between sort of open immigration to exclusion, it would be really interesting to hear more about that in reference to the subjects you're talking about. And the second question is one sort of a more desperate question, which is that it seems that on the ground, the forces of Frontex, et cetera, have done away with the binary quite nicely by in fact pushing back everyone, and that we're now in the middle of a sort of horrible new phase. And I'm wondering whether you see some sort of dialectical interaction from your perspectives in terms of redefinitions going on as a result of this very kind of violent moment of pushback that we're seeing. Thanks. Thank you.
Maybe I start and then Rebecca. No, you're very. I'll start with your second question. You're very right with this desperate question of getting rid of the binary in a way where nobody gets inside. And I think this is the reason why also the binary holds, because there is some few that we can get inside that we're not going to start to question the definitions or the representation that gives them privilege. And that's where we have to hold tight to separate, our political goals to our academic thoughts, and not to give up to the fact that the idea for me doesn't hold in an intellectual way, and so that would be my answer for this desperate question that I share with you. And then for the post-colonial, what I can tell you more is like the weight of the post-colonial question at these times regarding at these years I studied, really like the 80s, and it's interesting to see that we are at a time where France is building what we called France-Afrique. I think maybe which is switching the colonial influence by post-colonial influence in economic fields, political fields, etc. And this group of people requesting asylum from Zaire, it's very interesting to see that it goes beyond the post-colonial, but it encompasses it, because Zaire is also a country which is very close to communist country, Angola, and I'm sorry, I forgot about my geography, but there are two ones. And so it's very strategic for France at this moment, because it's a very rich country. It is seen as a country that can stop communist invasion in Africa, and it is seen as a country that can, if they're not on the French side, because they're Francophone, but it's not a former colony, Zaire, it's a Belgian colony, but they have big influence on other French colonies, former colonies, and so there is something very strategic about not giving asylum to people coming from Zaire, because it's very, very important to hold good relationship with, at the time, Mobutu, for this mixture of reasons, which is post-colonial communism, and I think that for each, my point of view, and I write in the introduction, is that for each group, it's all the time, it's a different configuration. It's similar elements, you know, it's like post-colonial, Cold War, diplomatic affairs, domestic affairs. I don't have time, but some groups it's more, and so you have these different elements that are common, and for each situation in each at each time or each group arriving, it's a specific configuration of these different elements that plays, and they're all political. That's how I can answer.
I'll just quickly jump in on the violent moment question from Lori, which certainly was something I thought about a lot towards the end of this process, because I started writing this book, or I started thinking about writing this book in 2015. And then I had to ask myself many times during the Trump administration and events in Europe, you know, is Trump a post-binary president? Is Frontex a post-binary agency, right? And so the answer that I've come to is no, is that actually the binary still looms very large and is deployed in ways that make us very unprepared for this particular political moment as advocates, because it still insists on the existence of the refugee category, but falls back really hard on the third prong of the logic of the binary that I talked about in my presentation, which is that true refugees are rare, right? And so it starts feeling like that game of cups where like the real refugee is hidden under a cup, but it's just never the one that we're lifting up, right? So throughout the Trump administration, they're saying, we absolutely love refugees. We want to protect the real refugees. And maybe they're persecuted Christians, or maybe they're people trying to flee North Korea, but they're not the people, they're not the phonies that are actually on our doorstep. It's never the people that are actually on our doorstep. Similarly, Europe is paying a lot of lip service to the idea of this imagined refugee that is always somewhere else, right? It's not the person in front of us. And so I think in this way, the binary logic actually perpetuates some of these violent moments that you're talking about, because they're possible because the people that are being targeted aren't the ones that we promise we want to protect. And in fact, the US actually got pretty aggressive with this logic by saying that, by sort of saying, we can't admit more of the pure and true real refugees that are waiting patiently overseas this year because we've spent too much on border control measures to stop all the fake people, right? And Australia does this as well. For every asylum application that they do grant, they like cut their overseas resettlement numbers. So these populations are being pitted against each other in ways that make me think we're not post-binary. The binary is still very much part of the dialogue.
Okay, we have time for one more question here from Amanda Pinedo.
Thank you so much, Karen and Rebecca, for this conversation. Rebecca, very timely you mentioning the post-binary, and I've been working on what's called the humanitarian migrants, those who are being labeled under humanitarian migration policy, TPS holders, especially in this conversation about humanitarian parole. And I think both, even Karen in Europe could jump in this conversation. Do you think that when you start talking about humanitarian migrants, is it a new label, a new form of categorization that's emerging from these political discourses about they are not refugees, they are not migrants, right? They are in this permanent, temporary situation. I would love to hear what you have heard, what you think about, if you think that's a new label that's coming up, if it emerges from these in-between concepts, and how it's related to this new migration called humanitarian migration policies and political responses that we have seen, especially in response to the Haitian migration to the US and in Europe too.
Great. I guess I'll start and then pass the baton to Karen. And I think maybe I can answer your question and also address the question that Maria put in the chat, because I think they're related. But no, I don't think the concept of humanitarian protection is particularly new. I think it's been around for several decades now. And to the extent that countries like the United States have created additional measures, as the examples that you've given, I think that they can coexist with refugee protection in some way. But one of the things that I think is preventing us from imagining those categories as being equally deserving or equally important is the fact that we hold this refugee concept up as the sort of most deserving category still to this day, even with the existence of other alternative forms of protection. And so it's always a secondary status. It's not always, it doesn't always put people on the path. Other, alternative complementary forms of protection don't always put people on the path to citizenship, don't come with the same types of benefits. And so, and that's sort of what I meant to address Maria's point when I say, if we relegate the Refugee Convention to just one tool in a toolkit, it ceases to carry this enormous weight that places it sort of in a hierarchy above other forms of protection. If we say some people are going to qualify for that status, other people who are equally vulnerable or equally deserving might qualify for these other protective statuses. We could elevate and get more creative about other forms of protection that we think may help fill in some of the gaps that the refugee definition obviously leaves. Even if you take an extremely expansive read of the Refugee Convention, it's not, it can't expand indefinitely, and it's going to reach its limits. And there's still potentially people that advocates might want to advocate for, that I think to focus on elevating the status of those other categories would be a really useful approach, in my opinion.
So I fully agree with what Rebecca said. What maybe I can add in going also maybe first through the question of Maria, is that so how can we defend the refugee category, which would continue the dichotomy, but also defend the alternatives? But and I think from there, I mean, it brings us to another discussion, but which is a very important discussion, and we don't have time to do here, and it's not the scope, but on the whole question of deconstructing the idea of migration, economic migration, or migration as a burden, or as the economic problem, or as a demographic problem, or and here I have 2 minutes, but there is, I mean, amazing material and studies that shows that the idea of weight of a problem doesn't hold a lot in front of the empirical work of economists on migration, and instead of defending a dichotomy which is intellectually wrong, and also pushes most of the people away, we should put much more energy in tackling this very deep-rooted idea of migration as a problem, which historically doesn't hold either economically. I mean, doesn't the way migration is thought as a problem, it doesn't have any seeds in historical, economical, sociological work. If people can move, they go. And I can't even start the discussion. But and so this brings me back to this question of humanitarian status. So humanitarian status is there as a, how do you say it? I mean, it kind of solves a little bit of the problem, because we are stuck in this situation where where migration channels are closed because there is this idea that it's wrong, and so asylum regime is full of myths, but I don't believe it's the right way to intellectually and politically to tackle the dilemmas.
I mean, we are at time, but I would like to very much thank Karen again for joining us from Tel Aviv, very late now her time. Also Rebecca, Roger Waldinger for his comment. And I just want to remind you that we will reconvene after the break on January 21st to discuss Brexit land. I hope you will join us. In the meanwhile, have a happy holiday season. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much.